The other day, whilst looking through some Railway series compilations, I came across these books which have really nice introductions from Wilbur Awdry, so I thought I'd do a quick video showing these books released from the pre-TV series era to after Series 2 had aired. There are 6 books in total. 2 are reprints with a different title and cover, but almost no other differences. The other 4 were produced exclusively for W.H. Smith, a shop you may not be aware of if you're not from the UK, but it's a long-standing stationery shop that no one can still quite believe is going. These books all bear the old retro logo and have a matching cover design present on the front and back. The red book, Engine Stories, was published in 1982 and features Thomas the Tank Engine Thomas again, Gallant Old Engine, Stepney the Bluebell Engine, and Tramway Engines. The blue book, Further Engine Stories, was published in 1983 and features Gordon the Big Engine, Edward the Blue Engine, James the Red Engine, Henry the Green Engine, and the 3 railway engines. The orange book, More Engine Stories, was published in 1984 and features Toby the Tram Engine, 4 Little Engines, Little Old Engine, Oliver the Western Engine, and Duke the Lost Engine. And finally, the green book, Selected Engine Stories. This was published in 1985 and features Troublesome Engines, Percy the Small Engine, Duck and the Diesel Engine, Mainline Engines, and Enterprising Engines. There are 20 Railway series volumes in these compilations in total, meaning that 6 of Wilbur's books missed out. Some are obvious omissions like Mountain Engines, which never really gets much attention, and Small Railway Engines, which only has its characters appear in the background of the rest of Wilbur's books. Some are a bit more surprising though. Branch line engines, the twin engines, and the 8 famous engines are all absent, as well as very old engines. This is maybe less surprising, but as the final Scar Lowy series book, it seems a missed opportunity. I believe if a 5th book was ever released, let's imagine it was yellow and called Extra Engine Stories perhaps, it would probably feature twin engines, branch line engines, small railway engines, very old engines, and the 8 famous engines, with mountain engines missing out once more. Inside, the books all feature an image on the title page. Engine Stories makes a mistake here, and includes an illustration from branch line engines instead of an included book. The contents page will look similar to anyone who has seen other compilation releases. The title pages will do as well. Featuring the same illustration and background colour as the normal volumes. There is one exception, however. The Little Old Engine here features a brown cover for some reason. I may well in future make another video on other compilation books, as they all have something interesting about them. All these books end with a map of Sodor. Engine Stories and Further Engine Stories both feature this map by Peter Edwards. However, the later books, More Engine Stories and Selected Engine Stories, have the first Clive Spung map, complete with his extra illustrations around the edge. With various points of interest from the stories that the books include. The nicest thing about all these books is they have an introduction. Each one is different. They may have been included in some other compilations, but I think they make the books rather special. In the filing cabinet in my study there is a large bundle of letters. They are all the letters which girls and boys and grown-ups too have sent me ever since the first of my little books was published. It always amazes me to think that when my son Christopher caught measles and we made up our first story, we were starting a series of books which girls and boys would like so much. It began quite simply. We had a little rhyme. Early in the morning, down at the station, all the little engines standing in a row. Along comes the driver, turns the little handle, puff puff, chuff chuff, off we go. What was the engine's name, Daddy? Asked Christopher. Edward, I told him. It was the first name that came into my head. Why was he sad, Daddy? Because he was old and hadn't been out for a long time. And so, with Christopher asking questions and me thinking up answers, we made up the story which became the first story in the first book. It hadn't got a title then, but you know it as Edward's Day Out. The sad story of Henry happened the same way. We started with a rhyme and made up the story. When we had settled the words of both stories, as Christopher liked them, I wrote them down to help me remember the right words in telling the story every time. A third story came next, about Edward and a bossy engine called Gordon. Christopher was well again by the time this one was finished, but he still wanted the stories told over and over again. Though he liked them, I doubted whether anyone else would, but Mrs. Audrey thought they ought to be published. At last a friend showed them to Mr. Edmund Ward. He liked them, and said that if I wrote another story bringing Henry out of his tunnel and making the three engines friends again, he would make the 4 stories into a book. We did this, and the first book, The 3 Railway Engines, came out in 1945. I had made Christopher a wooden push-along model of Edward. I made him a wooden tank engine too, which he called Thomas, so long before we had to have stories about Thomas. We sent these to Mr. Ward, and Thomas the Tank Engine came out in 1946. There are now 26 books, and girls and boys still like them even though no steam engines are left on British rail, and you have to go to preserved lines like the Bluebell, the Severn Valley or the Talachlin to see them. So far, all the books have been made separately, but now that 7 million have been sold, we are celebrating this by making an omnibus edition, in which several books appear together. I think that's a splendid idea. I hope you will like it too. Further Engine Stories has a slightly abridged introduction. In the filing cabinet in my study there is a large bundle of letters. They are all the letters which girls and boys and grown-ups too have sent me ever since the first of my little books was published. It always amazes me to think that when my son Christopher caught measles and we made up our first story, we were starting a series of books which girls and boys would like so much. It began quite simply. We had a little rhyme. Early in the morning, down at the station, all the little engines standing in a row. Along comes the driver, turns the little handle, puff puff, chuff chuff, off we go. What was the engine's name, Daddy? Asked Christopher. Edward, I told him. It was the first name that came into my head. But why was he sad, Daddy? Because he was old and hadn't been out for a long time. And so, with Christopher asking questions and me thinking up answers, we made up the story which became the first story in the series about an engine called Edward. I made Christopher a wooden push-along model of Edward and a wooden tank engine which he called Thomas, and before long we had to have stories about Thomas the Tank Engine too. There are now 26 books, and girls and boys still like them, even though no steam engines are left on British rail, and you have to go to preserved lines like the Bluebell, the Severn Valley or Talachlin to see them. Last year we made an omnibus edition of Engine Stories, and you like these so much we have made another big book of 20 more stories for you to read and enjoy. As that last compilation featured Henry the Green Engine, there were actually 21 stories. This one's got a little bit of an inscription from the previous owner. Two things happened in 1951 which had an important effect on the railways on the island of Sodor. The first was a holiday at Yarmouth when my son Christopher and I met a steam tram engine hauling wagons in the docks. There and then we decided that Toby the tram engine was just what the Fat Controller needed to work his quarry line at Farquhar. The second was the formation of the first ever Railway Preservation Society. It was founded to save the narrow gauge Talachlin Railway in Tywyn at Wales. I'm proud to say that I was among the first 100 members. Christopher and I visited the line regularly and worked on it, and true stories we collected about it and other narrow gauge railways are told in 4 Little Engines, Little Old Engine and the Skarloey Railway books. On the Talachlin Railway, the 2 old engines, Talachlin, No. 1, and Dolgoch, number 2, were soon joined by 2 others, Sir Hayden and Edward Thomas, which came from another railway recently closed. Likewise, 2 other engines, Sir Handel and Peter Sam, joined our old engines Skarloey and Rennius when the former line had been closed too. It was not long before boys and girls and their parents too wrote asking where Peter Sam and Sir Handel had come from and what their railway had been like. If you want to know about that, don't write to me, but read the stories of Duke the Lost Engine in this volume. The other stories are about Oliver. If you want to see an Oliver at work, either go to the Didcot Railway Centre on a steaming day, or better still to the Dart Valley Railway where, during the summer, an Oliver pulls trains between Buckfastleigh and Totnes. You will be able to see a duck there too. I hope you will enjoy this collection of stories as much as the others. Since he appeared on television, Thomas has been grumbling. A good set of programmes on the whole, he would say, and everyone called it the Thomas programme, but there wasn't enough about me. The other engines poked themselves in too much. Of course they're good engines in their way, but they're not important tank engines like me. I told him not to be silly. Think of Percy, I said. He's important. You couldn't run your branch without him. Duck and Oliver are important too. They've got a branch line like you have. That's why we're making this new collection of stories. Yes, I see what you mean, said Thomas. Don't forget Bill and Ben either. They've got their own line too, and had splendid fun teasing Gordon. I wish I'd been there to see them. Of course, he went on, there are some important tender engines like City of Truro and Flying Scotsman. We could bring them in too. That would only be fair. We both hope you will enjoy this selection of stories. The reprinted books have nothing new in them. Engine Stories got reprinted as Thomas the Tank Engine and Other Railway Stories, and Selected Engine Stories was reprinted as More Railway Stories featuring Thomas the Tank Engine. It's clear that the TV series had an effect on marketing here, although why Selected Engine Stories was picked over Further Engine Stories, with its more familiar stories and characters, is a mystery to me. Inside, the only difference is the title page has changed to reflect the new title and publishers. And the page with the publishing details has reflected this. The covers show a scene from 4 of the 5 stories, but maintains a similar cover design to the previous books, with the arch for the Rev W. Audrey, the serif font for the titles, and the border that goes around the outside. All the books are also exactly the same size. One thing these books do have that's different though, is a blurb on the back. The Rev W. Audrey's famous Railway series is one of the top children's favourites of all time. In this delightful volume is a collection of some of the most enchanting stories illustrated throughout with the original colour illustrations. Here are adventures about Thomas, that cheeky little tank engine who is so proud to have a branch line all to himself, but even under the strict eye of the Fat Controller he manages to find trouble. Meet Thomas's friends, Gordon who pulls the express train, the thoughtful engines Edward, Henry, Duck, James and the troublesome trucks, and many more. Also see what a hero Rennius is when he returns home to the other little engines, and what excitement there is when Stepney from the Bluebell Railway comes to visit. There are other stories about Thomas's branch line, including stories of Percy's Woolly Bear and Toby's Tightrope, and the one that Thomas didn't want to put in, the story of Thomas's ghost. You can share in these exciting adventures on the magical island of Sodor, where life is never ordinary. Here are more adventures about Thomas, that cheeky little tank engine and all his friends. See how Henry meets an elephant and James spins round like a top. Percy, that lively small engine, has many exciting adventures, but what could possibly happen to bring Harold the helicopter on the scene? Discover the mystery of the Fat Controller's missing trucks and the calamity caused when a green hat is mistaken for a Guards flag. Life on the line is always full of activity and excitement. You can share in all these adventures on the magical island of Sodor. I hope you enjoyed this quick little look at this sweet compilation series. See you again soon.